Roos Innovations is an idea lab, and Roos is my maiden name, and I named the company after my father, who was an entrepreneur. The first idea in the idea lab that has come out into the world is an advisory practice where I provide policy advice in the derivatives and traded markets area. I wanted to do something where I could create this advisory space for companies where I wasn't just getting paid for normal service as a consultant, but instead creating relationships and helping people take their ideas and make them real in regulated markets in particular. The constant volatility in regulation and policy change was becoming something that was difficult for companies to handle, and I felt that because of my background, I could help them navigate that.
What were the pivotal moments in your career?
When subprime mortgages were becoming popular, that was pivotal for me because I was very interested in what was happening with the expansion of subprime mortgages, but I learned that, in fact, as a policy matter, subprime mortgages were not considered really a bad thing because there was a desire at that time at the policy level to have more and more people have the opportunity to buy a home. So that was my first sort of pivotal moment in understanding how governments desire to move the direction of society through financial markets. The second time was, of course, my time building the regulatory structure for swaps. And of course, that involved interacting with a number of regulatory bodies, including non-US bodies that were trying to grapple with regulation of swaps, interacting and working and partnering with the CFTC, which remains a wonderful partner to NFA. At the same time as the CFTC was implementing Dodd-Frank, lawmakers were still working on some of the rules for security-based swaps, and so we were helping to provide input there. It was extremely hard work, and it was not ever done. And it took a lot of creative solutions because there are continuous barriers to a complete sharing of information baked into the law. And then the third pivotal moment was after I moved to Texas, I began to do this advisory work out of my little idea lab. At first, didn't think that I would ever want to do project-based work or create a company around my derivatives expertise. I was really only interested in running a business for music, period. But some friends of mine in the industry, Jill Summers in particular, had been a wonderful mentor and friend to me and asked me if I would help with a project. And that completely changed my mind about what it might mean to be entrepreneurial and in the private sector at the same time.
How did your experience shape your understanding of policy design?
The attention that's required over these experiences, both being a structured derivatives lawyer, working at ISDA and helping the industry develop best practices and trading templates, and then looking at it from the vantage point of working at the Fed and thinking of the larger sort of supervisory concerns affecting derivatives and other parts of the financial system. I've started to realize that attention is required, and going back to my musical upbringing, that makes sense scientifically, that attention's required in everything. When I'm singing, if I don't have the perfect amount of tension in my body, no sound is created at all. If I have too much tension, the sound is gripped and doesn't project and is unpleasant. And I think it's the same when it comes to oversight and markets. The markets require enough flexibility to grow and expand and experiment, but they require also the responsible regulatory structure and legal structure for those markets to have enough constraint to be risk managed well, for the larger economy to be protected, and when the tension is right, it thrives, it's very healthy. If it's too tight and nothing can grow, then the market just doesn't produce any money and it can't function. If it's too loose, no sound is produced whatsoever, just like in music, and the market collapses on itself. There cannot be an abdication of responsibility by lawmakers, policymakers, and regulators, but at the same time, the market has to be allowed to be free enough to create.
How have regulations on stablecoins, market structure, and climate disclosures changed the markets?
Sometimes we think that regulation or government intervention should change the markets or influence the markets, and I disagree. The role of oversight is to provide that proper balance of tension so that markets remain healthy. If anything, in terms of the climate disclosure rules that are no longer going forward at the federal level here in the US, but they still exist at the state level, while in other countries there are climate risk disclosure rules, that represents a change in the way markets behave, but I don't think it fundamentally changes underlying market fundamentals. And so what I have seen is that markets that had their legs under them and that had real opportunity and growth are proceeding apace, because if a market is germinating well and has shoots coming up, that market can continue to produce and advance anyhow. And part of that is because it's cultural. Markets are here to serve needs. And if those needs exist and there's a demand, that market's going to keep building and building. And unless the government literally stops it, calls it illegal, that market's going to continue to thrive. There are markets that are weak and not ready yet, and there are some administrations that choose a policy path of support or subsidization in order to make those markets move. In those cases, those markets may move forward for a time, but eventually they will have to stand on their own 2 feet. And so any growth that would have occurred is most likely short-term until they can get on their own 2 feet. So what I've seen with regard to the policy changes that we've noticed lately is that markets that were already growing continue to move forward. Much like in physics, the laws of physics and the laws of markets tend to operate irrespective of intervention, unless the intervention is enough to either shut a market down or to fund it completely.
What are your thoughts on the growth in prediction markets?
It doesn't mean, in my view, that a particular market is good, bad, ugly, more likely to succeed or not, less likely to succeed, but rather, to me, it represents a paradigm shift that we're in with regard to the expansive nature of opportunity at this time. That does seem to be driven by a tone of innovation forward thinking in our current mindset from a policy perspective. In that sense, the tone of policy can shape and change what's thriving. But I would note that even though our tone right now is pro-innovation, in fact, these markets were expanding and growing prior to those stated changes in tone. And that again goes back to my point that markets thrive in a similar way to the way science laws behave. They happen because of need, and they happen because of the drive to serve need. They represent a larger theme, which is an underlying expansion of the drive to serve wider interests in client behavior and a wider net that's being cast across the interested parties who want to participate in markets. And that's bringing more and more parties to the table. I don't know exactly how long and how wide the net's gonna be there, but it appears to me that we are in a state of expansion that's very exciting to watch.
What is the future of the prediction markets?
You remember I mentioned the tension that's necessary in markets. I do think that there's a challenge in that space in particular, that we have a little bit of a gap in terms of the voices at the table from a legislative and a regulatory perspective, saying what people may need to hear in terms of interpretation. There's a little bit too much quiet perhaps on the regulatory and the legislative side. And that may be creating, if we now think about maybe a violin string, the string is maybe a little loose, and that's requiring people to have to interpret for themselves. And that's why we now have litigation in order to try to resolve all the questions. That's actually healthy, I think, because in our system, all of these different areas allow us to get to the correct result, or at least get to a result. I personally don't mind the back and forth. I think that some cognitive dissonance in a growth period is critical. And if we don't accept a little discomfort, then we won't have the robust markets that create the greatest amount of competition, the greatest amount of free market trading, and honestly, the greatest profitability.
What lessons do you wish you knew earlier?
The range of things that were out of my control, so that I would be clearer about the things that are in my control and do those things better. I think that when I was in particular working on building the regulatory program for swaps regulation, I was so focused on building the program and hiring the people and doing all the coordination that I didn't do as well at stepping outside of all of that to reflect on all the things that are bigger, like my health or my relationships and my time for myself, walking down a sidewalk. And I believe that as an entrepreneur, the thing I am doing most in my idea lab and in the practice I'm trying to create is learning as much as I can how to lean hard on those things, because I believe they make me so much better, exponentially better at doing the job that I do every day for clients.
Do you have any thoughts on the regulation of AI?
I think right now the US has a not bad approach to this, which is to insist that the regulatory oversight that we currently have already covers it. And that's not an unfair approach to take, because if you think about AI, it's just a tool like any other, and we already have oversight over lawyer behavior. We have oversight over our markets. We have oversight over market participants. All of those activities and people still have to meet their job responsibilities in an honorable fashion according to set rules, and it doesn't matter what tool you're using as to whether those rules apply. For example, I don't get to abdicate the method in which I carry out my work just because I happen to use a computer to carry out that work, or I wouldn't turn in an assignment having only used spell check and not having reread the message or the memo. I wouldn't do that, and it would be considered unethical. So same goes for the use of AI. So I think right now we're probably in a good place in the US because it allows us to keep creating and building these tools out without constraining them and straitjacketing them. And all of the risk management principles and requirements that are out there for various segments are still 100% applicable.